Hello everyone, José Gámez in College of Arts and Architecture. I will try to illustrate my sense of failure by showing you the first slide that I used when I was interviewing here at UNC Charlotte almost 22 years ago, in 2002. So got here in the summer of 2002. I was teaching at UNLV in Las Vegas at the time. And one of the things I was quite interested in, and still am interested in, is the role that culture plays in architecture and design and art, both as a commodity, as a thing that we market, we sell, that we might live around in the world of celebrity, a time in which, in the early 2000s, when people like Rem Koolhaas, a Dutch architect, was as popular in some circles as Miss Britney Spears might have been at that moment as well. In fact, in that year, in the year prior, Mr. Koolhaas had been on tour, so to speak, on lecture series and teaching at multiple institutions around the globe over 300 days of the year, while Britney, in her lackadaisical ways, had only been on the road for 184 days that year on her tour. So this was a kind of moment for me to reflect on the way that society looks at the culture industries and what we do with our rock stars, so to speak, in those industries, and what they're maybe missing. And we're going to come back to that. And part of what we're missing is that the cycle of celebrity tends to run a lot more, at a much more rapid pace than we like to think that architecture, design, and the arts might. We talk about timelessness in the arts, we talk about beauty that might transcend eras, that might transcend style, that might not get caught up with trends in and of themselves, but in fact, in many cases, we're part of that cycle of cultural production that is about commodification of ideas, maybe not always in the best interest of both the arts, the designers, or the people that they might serve. You might wonder, how does one get interested in art, design, and Britney and Rem and all those kinds of things? Well, I started off at a place called East Texas State University. I was a transfer kid. And I met a bunch of folks at East Texas State who were art majors, commercial art majors, who back in the late 1900s had to draw by hand on big sheets of mylar, kind of thin plastic film, using ink and rapidographs to come up with their own typography, their own letters, that were literally 36 inches, right, with no deviation. They had to have a really smooth hand, create these Q's and O's and A's, and then poche them, fill them in evenly, and then that was part of their production for their presentations that I would go to. And I was amazed at the conversations that they were having with their instructors about the novel innovations that I couldn't see because I wasn't smart enough, or the amazing amount of talent that these folks had that I knew that I didn't think I had. So I didn't apply to the art program. I didn't apply to commercial art, photography, any of those programs. I was in industrial design. I learned how to draft. I needed tools to help me draw a straight line, because I can't color within the lines, much less create the lines that need to be colored within, at least I thought. But I got excited about architecture. I had to work as a college kid, and I did a lot of painting, a lot of handy person work. I dug septic lines, and there's a poor, crude joke I could say about that, but it's not a good job. And I thought, well, I liked working with my hands. I like the built environment. I like houses and buildings. Maybe I'll study buildings. So I looked around, and there was UT Austin down the road, but I was an East Texas kid, and everything was maroon where I grew up, so I went to A&M, which was the rival school, which also had another architecture program. Not knowing much about architecture, not really knowing much about a big institution, but I transferred in, which set me back about a year in terms of progression to graduation. As many of you might know, if you might have friends who've transferred, you may have transferred yourselves at some point from one place to another. You don't always start where you thought you want to start. So I spent a lot of time catching up, so to speak. But I got to a point in my third year of undergraduate where I had begun to find a kind of groove. I felt like I was kind of getting my feet under me, and I was doing okay. I was a solid B kid. I still am a sort of solid B person. I have to work, but I can get a B. I can easily work and get a C, but I'm pretty cognizant of when my standards are slipping. I had to really struggle to get an A. But I wasn't really clear what it would take to get an A, especially in a new landscape at Texas A&M. So I figured out who the smart kids were, several of them, David Parrish, who's not here with us, but he's running a program, a Viz program in Fort Worth now for A&M. He's a visualization guy. He's worked for Disney and Sony and all these other folks. He and 3 of his friends were always dedicated to finding the hardest studio instructors, the hardest teachers, and signing up for that class. And I was like, well, that's their recipe for success. I should do the same. So I started following wherever those guys went. I followed them into those studios. And I got to a studio in 3rd year, drawing by hand, still writing on chalkboards. And we got to a professor called Jerry Maffey, who asked us to have one sheet of paper. We're going to do, for a 2-week project, we're going to do 7 projects over 14 weeks. You have one piece of paper, one pencil, no erasers, and you were going to go to the library and research a topic, write a short problem statement that was essentially like a thesis statement, if then and that, and then a solution that might be involved with architecture or design. And then you had this one drawing pad that you drew on and reworked without erasing to create a final presentation 2 weeks into. 7 of these in a row. First one I get, I draw and I draw and I draw, and I'm up all night just like all good architecture students are, and I get a big old F on that project. And I'm thrown for a loop. I don't get it, I don't understand. I thought I would have been doing pretty well. I'm in my 3rd year, I was already an honors kid, at least a Dean's List kid. First project, 2 weeks in, I get an F, and I'm just floored. I don't know what to do. So I go home in my crushed self, go back to my little apartment hovel that I only saw really on Wednesday nights and on Saturday nights, it seemed like. And I tried to figure out what was going on. So I decided, well, I better research this Mr. Maffey guy. So I went to the course catalogs, and I went to, back then you had to go to the library to look for stuff. I didn't quite have the internet. I found out Jerry Maffey was a UC Berkeley grad from the late 1960s. Oh, I didn't know what UC Berkeley was, or the 1960s really. At least not in the way that Berkeley played a role in the 1960s with the free speech movement, for example. I found out a little bit more about his biography. I found a research paper that he had read. It was completely incomprehensible. But I hung on to that stuff, and I read as much as I could to figure out what he was trying to get us to think about. And in the end, these are the 2 things that I remember most from my undergraduate education. 3 things. One is that F, but the 2 outcomes from that semester, which I made an A in the class. But the design requires research, right? It's not just inspiration, lightning bolt strikes, and the thing you touch turns to gold. That's not true for most of us, for most B kids, right? You work for that moment of inspiration, and you work for that moment of recognition that might come in the form of an A. And that might take some research that goes beyond the scope of what you initially thought the assignment was. And in this case, beyond the scope meant that research is about people, and that buildings of the design that you're committing to is about the public world. And that it's hard to imagine who those people are sometimes. Again, research. So that ended up taking me to look for graduate school at UC Berkeley. I got lucky and I got accepted. Ultimately, that led me to think about UCLA in the late 1900s, when that place was up in arms just following some very notorious court proceedings around the Rodney King procedures. Around 1992, I guess it was, Los Angeles was burning, so I figured I should go there and get myself well immersed with the landscape of culture and design from a slightly different perspective, not from the perspective of design as a commodity, culture as a commodity, but culture as a product of people in the environment, imbuing the environment with their needs, their interests, their goals, desires, and how the differences that might take from the everyday environment on the upper left in East LA, from immigrant landscapes, to the very formalized environments, to the things that might get preserved in historical monuments in downtown LA. Ultimately, that's led me to work in a variety of realms that involve performance and theater and outdoor stages, high schools in Las Vegas, so that I still consult with folks, but all of these as ways of beginning to imagine the built environment as a stage for people to do things in the world that stemmed from that moment when I got in it. The thing that I carry forward, the thing that I remember 20 years later, is really tied back to that one moment in undergraduate. But I'll hand it off now.